it's hard to reproduce things using other things. Like, we have milk, and we have oat milk, and we have almond milk, and we have soy milk. They all taste different, right?
Yeah.
They're not quite milk, because like we have to understand. Presumably, we have to understand our own biological consciousness before we could understand how to mimic that using resources other than brains, unless you just want to reconstruct a brain.
Overthink, understand.
Do you think the simulation theory is real? Is sound?
Is it sound? Okay, well, what is it? Like, the 2 or 3 premises have to be in fact true then for it to be sound, and they have to logically follow from one another.
I mean, it's not actually obvious that you should accept Nick Bostrom's view of evolution and human civilization. So he first goes on to describe a progressive civilization, a civilization whose computing power increases, right? And that's the marker of the civilization in the thesis, right? Mm-hmm. And then imagine many, many possible worlds, many parallel universes that all have a similar appearance of human experience, in which human experience and consciousness seems to resemble. Now, how many of those are going to be able to simulate similar experiences or simulate their own evolutionary history, right? So the trichotomy or the 3 disjuncts goes either the number of such civilizations in all possible worlds is very close to 0, or the number of worlds that are interested or have people who are interested and have resources in running such simulations is very close to 0, or the number of simulated human experiences or civilizations is very close to 1, which is to say very close to 100%. Right? And the idea basically is, because if you think about it, any civilization who are A, interested, and B, capable of running simulations of their own history with consciousness embedded, they're going to be able to simulate a large number of simulations, right? So unless such worlds are very, very, very few,
right,
then most human experiences in the sphere of possible worlds is going to be simulated, right? It's just a matter of probability, and it rests on us being uncertain, like us being unable to discern from what we know from our human experience whether we are in a simulation or not. Right. Because if you had any concrete empirical evidence, then you don't have to rely on probability. You just use simple, or not simple, but scientific induction to determine whether we are in a simulation. But it's only when we can't really tell from observation, right? That's when Nick Bostrom's theory holds. And it's nonetheless quite compelling.
Right? I think probably the easiest way to argue against it is to argue that simulating consciousness without a biological system is impossible. And even if it isn't impossible, we have no evidence to say that it is possible. So why should we believe that it's possible? Doesn't seem that it is, right? It's like there are elements that conduct to be very reductionist and to give a very simple example. There are elements that conduct electricity, and they have certain properties that allow them to do that, right? And every element and its configuration is going to be different than that of a human brain. So why do we assume that we can use different elements and different configurations and create consciousness?
Well, it's a case against hubris, basically, right? Because if you consign the definition of minds to biological carbon-based systems, let's say, right, then you are making a claim about all future scientific endeavor, you are making a claim that we will never produce technologies or encounter alien life forms with different physical systems that also have consciousness, right? That's number one. But then the second problem in favor of the thought that our biological systems are probably uniquely suited to produce consciousness. Well, I know that you are conscious. If I were faced with a machine that passed the Turing test, that appears entirely human, right, and that it seems to react to the world and act in the world like a human being, I have more confidence that you have consciousness because I know that I do, right? It's the Descartes' cogito ergo sum. I know that I'm a thinking being, right? And I know that you and I are both have the same origin, the same evolutionary history, and the same physical origin, right? That we are sort of birthed and nursed by our mothers, right, and by our biological parents. That's why I'm confident
who are both
you have
Homo
consciousness,
sapiens.
right? Yeah, we're both Homo sapiens. Now, when faced with a machine passing the Turing test, I may change my mind because of the overwhelming sense, right? And literally the sense that I'm observing the machine and seeing that they act like us, right? And they react to things like us. Now, I may change my mind. So it depends really on what you think is most essential. Is the functions, right, the inputs and the outputs, essential? In this case, input being how the machine receives information and how they react to it, let's say. Is the functional more essential, or is the origin more essential? You might say that if, let's say, we were to produce machines that had very similar functions to ours, then, I mean, you may want to take a leap of faith based on a risk analysis, right? Let's say you weren't sure, but there's a non-zero probability that they have consciousness and that they are capable of suffering, right? Then you should probably accord such machines human rights or rights of some kind, because you don't want to take the risk of committing genocides or of enormous cruelty.
Right. Yeah. I think when you study biological systems, you realize, I think biology, even though it's been studied for so long, is one of the things we still know very, very little about. We have a very incomplete picture of so many systems, and that's why there's still heart disease. That's why there's still cancer. That's why there are still all these biological problems. If we understood biology well enough, we wouldn't have these problems. We can protect our computers from viruses pretty good now, but
We can't protect ourselves
we can't protect ourselves, and
from viruses.
even to create a mediocre vaccine to a new virus, that contagiousness and its maleffects are similar to that of the flu. Took us a year, right? Something like a year.
Yeah. And that's already a record.
Right. So I think to assume that eventually we're going to have enough understanding of biology because we have to understand, presumably we have to understand our own biological consciousness before we could understand how to mimic that using resources other than brains, unless you just want to reconstruct a brain. But then is that a simulation? It doesn't seem like if we're talking about simulations as brains in vats, sort of like the Matrix, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about us as CPUs in a simulation, where we're just a bundle of code, I don't know how you couldn't be highly skeptical of that. Because it's hard to reproduce things using other things. Like, we have milk and we have oat milk, and we have almond milk, and we have soy milk. They all taste different, right?
Yeah.
They're not quite milk. You know? It's like, it's really hard to create even simple things out of, because milk is it's made by a biological organism.
Yeah.
Right? We can't even recreate milk using other
artificial
substances
means,
that we have at our disposal.
Uh-huh.
So what makes us think we can recreate consciousness, something we don't even understand yet? We don't
so
even
fun.
have like a simple understanding of what it is.
Yeah.
Or at least I don't. I don't know if you do.
No. Don't look
All
at
I
me.
know is I'm here and it's weird as fuck.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's, like you said, reason to be skeptical, because if you simply shifted your focus away from inputs and outputs, right, and trying to recreate everything except what is internal to the potential candidate for consciousness, then you're creating a much easier problem for yourself, right? I just need to make it so that I do one thing to it, and it'll do this other thing, and it looks human, right? I mean, even that is hard enough, right? But it's even harder to know what's going on inside the black box, and to know that it is consciousness,
Right.
right?
Like we were talking about, is it possible in principle to replicate something that we only know to arise from biology by other means? But we could even use it. Think about, is it even possible in principle to understand the thing that does the thinking by thinking?
Right. It's a Heidegger's Dasein problem, right? Like how do you reflect on being as a being, right? Like how do you conceptualize not being as a being, right? Like, right? Because you are the thing that is in the world, right? Being in the world, right? And you use that fact to perform your reflections, your existential reflections, right? I don't know. I mean, another thing to think about the word or concept of consciousness is that, well, how is it that we don't fully understand what it is, or that we can't explain it in terms of cause and effects, right? And yet the word has quite some meaning to it. So is it the case that it's simply a kind of description that is rooted in our culture of language, or our language game, and that there's a incompatibility between the language biology and the language of consciousness, or the language of computer science and the language of consciousness, and that at some point we are bound to abandon that language game, and that the problem will go away on its own because it was a conceptual problem, and only a conceptual problem to begin with, right?
Yeah, I think it's hard to... I think consciousness may just be a term that we think is something separate from our sense perceptions, but it really may just be additive. It may be that consciousness is just all of our sense perceptions added together, and when you subtract those away one by one, you get a less conscious being. And when you have none of them, there's no consciousness. So if that's the case, we're very confused about what we mean by this word. Because our sense perceptions, like sight, sound, taste, smell, hearing, right? Our sense perceptions are what make us aware of things. Because you could say awareness is something separate, like it's its own distinct thing. And maybe you could reasonably argue that. Like if you're sitting meditating and you get into like a transcendental state and you're able to reach a place where you're just aware, but you don't feel like you're engaging with any of your sense perceptions. Maybe that's what consciousness is. Maybe you're deluding yourself. Maybe it's just the fact that you have your five senses I guess the thought experiment we could do is, like, if I took all your senses away from you right now, and you could still think, would you be aware, or would you not? I think that would be the experiment you have to run. So you'd have to have someone like Helen Keller, who already can't hear and can't see, and then take away the rest of her senses. And the problem is that they have no way to tell you that they are aware in that case, because if you can't feel, you can't move, right? If you can't,
Can you not?
no, I don't think so.
Well, I mean, there are more senses than 5, right? Right. There's a sense of the position of your limbs, sense of balance, sense or weight, sense of temperature, and so on. Right. Like they're all different systems, but the thought experiment. I mean, you can put variations on it, right? So let's say you have a history of sensing, and then you suddenly had it taken away, or let's say you never had it. Right, that you were somehow flung into being in this, presumably, or I don't know, you might not have a comparison, but presumably miserable state of having no senses, right? I mean, first of all, there's a moral or ethical question of can you be considered to be alive or living? Maybe. But then also, will you have consciousness? Well, don't do it on me, or anyone for that matter.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I think if you took someone at birth who has never really had an explicit thought, and you took all their senses away, they probably don't have consciousness.
Well, we're already leaving the sphere of Homo sapien biology, right? We're already leaving that behind, because, well, if you didn't have any senses, would you be able to breathe? Would your heart be able to breathe? Like let's say your primitive brain, your brainstem, right, that does all the automatic work of beating your heart, right, and sending oxygen throughout your body, so that you remain alive and so that your brain keeps running. Well, yeah, you'll have to, first of all, not disrupt those systems, right? And are they integral in the creation of consciousness? Right. And if you took away the senses, would they? Because because then you would be arguing that you can use other physical systems to create consciousness, right? So when talking about the thought experiment, it may be interesting as a philosophical exercise, but I'm not sure if you want to leave biology.
I don't think you have to leave biology. I think we could. I mean, if it's just a thought experiment, you can say that you can cut the cords that allow people to have certain senses, and see what happens. My guess is that they wouldn't be able to be lucid and not have any senses. I think their body would just naturally go into a coma.
Right. Well, I'm not going to do it, right? Like, there's a whole host of ethical problems, but as speculation, right?
Right. I mean, there is something confused. I mean, because you could have a machine that can feel things and see things and hear things, but they're still, they're not conscious.
Oh, right. You mean, let's say our camera, let's say recording, right? It has a visual sense, right? Or our microphone has a sense of hearing, quote unquote, but we don't usually assume that they're conscious, right? Like, again, it could be, I mean, the entire problem could be a result of our language game, right? It's simply that we have this idea of consciousness without basis, or without theoretical basis, right? And that's why we can't seem to decide on a theory or come to a consensus theoretically.
Yeah. I think it's either something we can't it's either something we can't understand or we're confused about what it is, and that's why we haven't been able to conceptualize it in a way that we can understand it. Or it's a third possibility is that it's so complicated that in principle we can understand it, but we never will get to that point. Or maybe we will, but we're certainly not very close right now.
Well, that's to be proven empirically.
I think that's a good ending spot right there.
Yeah? You're just tired. You want to...
Well, Whole Foods closes in half an hour if you want popcorn.
Yeah, sure.
Dude,
Sending up...
my camera's on. Why does it do that?
Well,
It was definitely recording this time.
Yeah.
We saw it. I'm upset.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen me be upset before?
30 minutes of footage. I'm gonna have to... Yeah, well, we'll figure it out. Don't worry, Jacob. You're allowed to be frustrated, but you could leave it to me.
Thank you. You should be my therapist.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to tell me, Jacob?
No.
They ask you if you were fine, and you just have to say you're not fine. Well, that you're fine, but that you're not fine.
Wait, isn't that that's like a video from something?
That's a meme. Yeah.
Walk out the door, you see someone that you know, and they ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
That's the original clip.
There it is.
So it's not a simulation.
No.
Do you think the simulation theory is real?